An original story narrated exclusively for Love Written in Silence. Lady Marianne Ellsworth stands at her writing desk in the lamplight, her hand trembling as she seals the letter that will decide her future. The wax drips red against the cream paper, and she presses her family's crest into it before she can reconsider. Outside, rain begins to tap against the window panes of the modest manor, where she has lived all her 27 years. She hands the letter to the waiting servant, her voice barely steady as she whispers the name of the man she believes will understand her conscience. But in the dim corridor, the ink smudges, the name blurs, and by morning, the letter will rest in the hands of a man she has never dared to address, a man whose life of duty mirrors her own, whose silence has always seemed like indifference, but whose heart, once awakened, will not rest until he stands before her door. The autumn of 1847 settled over the English countryside with a peculiar heaviness. The harvest had been modest. The roads were thick with mud, and in the drawing room of Ellsworth Hall, Lady Mary sat with her hands folded in her lap, listening to her mother speak of advantageous marriages and family duty with the practiced ease of someone who had made peace with disappointment long ago. Marianne was the eldest daughter of a family whose fortunes had quietly declined over 2 generations. The estate was not grand. The lands were small. Her father, a kind but ineffectual man, had died 3 years prior, leaving behind debts that were never spoken of openly, but felt in every decision the family made. Her younger sister had married a country vicar the previous spring. Her brother had taken a commission in India, and Marianne, at 27, remained. She was not beautiful in the fashionable sense. Her features were too strong, her gaze too direct. But there was something in her bearing, a quiet dignity, a steadiness that made people trust her. She had been raised to be dutiful, to manage a household, to marry well if the opportunity arose. And now it seemed the opportunity had arrived. The younger son of the Duke of Ravenshire had been introduced to her at a county gathering 2 months prior. His name was Thomas Ravenshire. He was polite, well-dressed, and entirely unremarkable. He had smiled at her with the practiced charm of a man who had been taught how to behave in society, but had never questioned why. Their families had quietly agreed that a match would be suitable. Marianne's mother had been delighted. The Ravenshire name carried weight, even if Thomas himself carried little fortune. The arrangement would secure Marianne's future and restore some measure of respectability to the Ellsworth name. But Marianne had learned something in the weeks since the understanding had been reached. She had overheard a conversation between her uncle and a family solicitor. The engagement was not simply a matter of affection or convenience. It was tied to a financial agreement. The Ravenshire estate held land that bordered Ellsworth property. Thomas's portion of the family holdings included tenant farms that had been mismanaged for years. The rents had been raised. The tenants had been squeezed. And part of the marriage settlement involved the transfer of certain debts that would be paid, in part, by those same struggling families. Marianne had felt something shift inside her when she understood this. It was not anger exactly. It was a quiet, cold clarity. She was being asked to build her security on the suffering of others, and no one seemed to think this was worth mentioning. She could not speak of it to her mother. Her mother would have dismissed it as the way things were done. She could not speak of it to her uncle. He would have told her she was too sensitive. And so, late one evening, alone in her room with a single candle burning low, Marianne had made a decision. She would write to Thomas. She would tell him what she had learned. She would ask him, plainly, whether he believed it was right to enter a marriage built on such foundations. She would give him the chance to explain, to reassure her, or to acknowledge the truth. She wrote carefully. Her handwriting was clear and steady. She did not accuse. She did not plead. She simply laid out what she knew and asked the question that had been burning in her chest for weeks. Could duty and conscience coexist, or must one always be sacrificed for the other? When she finished, she sealed the letter with wax. She wrote his name on the front, but the light was dim. Her hand was tired, and the ink still wet, smudged slightly as she set the letter aside. She did not notice. She called for a servant and instructed that the letter be delivered to Ravenshire house the following morning. Then she blew out the candle and lay awake in the darkness, wondering if she had just destroyed her only chance at security, or saved herself from a life she could not bear to live. Ravenshire house stood on a rise overlooking a valley of rolling fields and ancient oak trees. It was a place of history and power, built in the previous century, and maintained with the kind of meticulous care that only old wealth could afford. The Duke of Ravenshire, Adrian Ravenshire, had inherited the title and the estate at the age of 24, when his father had died suddenly of a fever. He was now 33. He had never married. He had never courted anyone seriously. He had devoted himself entirely to the management of the estate, the welfare of the tenants, and the preservation of a legacy he had not asked for, but could not abandon. Adrian was a man of few words. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that he kept short, and a face that rarely betrayed emotion. People who met him often described him as cold, distant, unfeeling. But those who worked closely with him, his steward, his housekeeper, the tenants who had known him since boyhood, saw something different. They saw a man who carried the weight of responsibility without complaint, a man who listened more than he spoke, a man who made decisions slowly, carefully, and with a conscience that often kept him awake at night. His younger brother, Thomas, was his opposite in nearly every way. Thomas was charming and careless. He spent money he did not have. He made promises he did not keep. He had been raised in the same house, taught the same values, but had somehow emerged without the burden of duty that Adrian bore. Their father had favored Thomas. Their mother had indulged him, and Adrian had learned early that his role was not to be loved, but to be reliable. The morning the letter arrived, Adrian was in his study reviewing the accounts. The room was lined with books and maps. A fire burned low in the grate. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows. A servant entered and placed a small stack of correspondence on the desk. Adrian nodded his thanks and continued his work. It was only when he reached the third letter in the stack that he paused. The handwriting on the front was elegant, but slightly hurried. The wax seal bore a crest he recognized, the Ellsworth family. He assumed it was a note from Lady Ellsworth, Marianne's mother, regarding some detail of the engagement. He broke the seal and unfolded the letter, and then he read. The words were not what he expected. They were not polite pleasantries or logistical arrangements. They were a confession, a question, a quiet, devastating honesty that struck him like a blow to the chest. Marianne, Lady Marianne Ellsworth, had written to explain what she had learned about the financial terms tied to her engagement. She had written about the tenant farms, the raised rents, the debts that would be paid by families who could not afford them. She had written about her own discomfort, her doubt, her fear that she was complicit in something unjust. And then she had asked a question. Is it right to accept security that is built on the suffering of others? Can we enter a marriage with clear consciences if we know the cost is borne by those who have no voice? Adrian read the letter once, then again. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he held the paper. He recognized her handwriting. He had seen it on invitations, on notes exchanged between their families. But he had never seen words like these. He had never imagined that anyone in her position, a woman with limited options, facing pressure from her family, would question the terms of an engagement so directly, so bravely. And then he realized. The letter was addressed to Thomas. It was meant for his brother. The name on the front, smudged and unclear, had been misread by the servant who sorted the mail. This letter, this raw, honest, morally urgent letter, had been intended for a man who would never have understood it. A man who would have dismissed it, or worse, used it as an excuse to withdraw from the engagement without taking responsibility. Adrian stood. He folded the letter carefully and placed it inside his coat, against his chest. He did not call for Thomas. He did not consult his steward or his solicitor. He simply walked to the stables, ordered his horse saddled, and rode out into the rain without a word to anyone. Because he understood, in that moment, something he had not allowed himself to feel in years. He understood that there was someone in the world who thought as he did, who questioned as he did, who carried the same weight of conscience that he had thought was his alone to bear. and he could not let that voice go unanswered. The rain grew heavier as Adrian rode through the countryside. The roads were slick with mud. The sky was low and gray. He did not slow. He did not stop to consider what he would say when he arrived. He only knew that he had to go, that the letter in his coat was not a mistake. It was a revelation. Ellsworth Hall appeared through the mist, like a memory. It was smaller than Ravenshire House, less grand, but there was something dignified about it, something honest. Adrian dismounted in the courtyard, mud spattering his boots and coat. A servant opened the door, eyes widening at the sight of the Duke, standing in the rain, unannounced and alone. And then Marianne appeared. She stood in the doorway, framed by the warm glow of lamplight from within. In her hand, she held a folded piece of paper, a duplicate of the letter, perhaps, or notes she had been reviewing. Her face was pale. Her dark hair was pulled back simply. She wore a plain gray dress, no jewelry, no adornment. But when she saw him, her breath caught. Her eyes widened, and he saw, in that instant, the full weight of her realization. She had sent the letter to Thomas, and Adrian had received it. She stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. That was not meant for you. Adrian stood in the rain, his gaze steady and calm. Water dripped from the brim of his hat. His coat was soaked, but his voice when he spoke was quiet and certain. I know, he said. That is why I came. For a moment, neither of them moved. The rain fell. The wind stirred the trees. And then Marianne stepped back, opening the door wider, and Adrian walked inside. The entrance hall was warm and simple. A fire burned in a small hearth. The walls were lined with old portraits and faded tapestries. Marianne closed the door behind him, her hands trembling slightly. She did not call for a servant. She did not announce his presence. She simply stood there, holding the letter in her hand, and looked at him with an expression he could not quite name. Fear, perhaps, or hope. I should not have written it, she said quietly. You should have, Adrian replied, and I am glad you did. She shook her head. It was meant for your brother. It was not my place to. It was exactly your place. His voice was firmer now. You saw something wrong. You questioned it. You asked whether it could be made right. That is not weakness. That is courage. Marianne's eyes filled with tears, though she did not let them fall. I thought I would lose everything. You may still, Adrian said gently, but you will not lose your conscience. And that is worth more than any engagement. She looked at him then, truly looked at him, and saw something she had not expected. She saw a man who understood, a man who had read her words and felt their weight, a man who had ridden through the rain, alone, because he could not let her believe she was alone. Why did you come? She asked, her voice breaking slightly. Adrian took a step closer. Because for the first time in years, I read something that made me feel less alone. And I wanted you to know that you are not alone, either. The fire crackled softly. The rain drummed against the windows. And in that quiet, fire-lit hall, two people who had lived their entire lives under the weight of duty stood together and allowed themselves, for the first time, to be seen. The servant who had opened the door for the Duke did not keep the news to herself. By evening, the other members of the household staff knew that Duke Adrian Ravenshire had arrived unannounced in the rain and had been closeted in the entrance hall with Lady Marianne for nearly half an hour. By the following morning, the whispers had spread beyond the walls of Ellsworth Hall. A tradesman's wife mentioned it to a neighbor. A groom spoke of it at the village inn, and within 3 days, the rumor had reached the drawing rooms of every respectable family in the county. Why would the Duke ride alone in such weather to visit Lady Marianne? Was there some crisis, some scandal? Or, and this was whispered with particular relish, was there something more? Marianne's mother, Mrs. Ellsworth, was both bewildered and anxious. She questioned her daughter repeatedly, her voice rising with each unanswered inquiry. Why did he come, Marianne? What did he say? Did he bring news of Thomas? Is something wrong with the engagement? Marianne offered no explanation. She could not. How could she explain that the Duke had come not to court her, not to discuss the engagement, but to acknowledge a letter that had never been meant for him? A letter that questioned the very foundation of the arrangement her family was counting on. He came to discuss a matter of conscience, Marianne said finally, her voice quiet but firm. That is all I can say. Her mother stared at her, uncomprehending. A matter of conscience. What does that mean? Marianne, you must tell me. I cannot, Marianne said. And I will not. Mrs. Ellsworth's face flushed with frustration, but she did not press further. There was something in her daughter's tone, something resolute and unyielding, that made her hesitate. In the days that followed, Marianne and Adrian maintained a careful distance. He did not call again. She did not write. But the damage, as they say, was done. The rumor circulated quietly, but persistently. Marianne's reputation, once solid if unremarkable, became fragile. People began to wonder, to speculate, to question whether the engagement to Thomas was as secure as it had seemed. And beneath the surface of all this speculation, something else was happening. Adrian had returned to Ravenshire house and begun a quiet investigation. He summoned his steward. He reviewed the accounts related to the tenant farms that were part of Thomas's portion of the estate. He examined the rents, the debts, the agreements that had been made without his knowledge or approval, and what he discovered confirmed everything Marianne had written. The tenants were being squeezed. Families who had worked the land for generations were struggling to pay rents that had been raised arbitrarily. The money was being funneled into an account meant to cover Thomas's debts incurred through careless spending and poor investments. And the marriage settlement with the Ellsworth family had been structured, in part, to legitimize this arrangement, to make it respectable, to hide the exploitation beneath the veneer of a socially advantageous match. Adrian sat alone in his study, the account books spread before him, and felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. He had always known that his brother was careless. He had always known that the estate required constant vigilance to prevent mismanagement. But he had not known this. He had not known that his family's name was being used to justify suffering. And Marianne had seen it. She had seen it and had refused to accept it. She had written a letter that should have gone to Thomas, a letter that had found its way to Adrian instead, and had asked the question that no one else had dared to ask. Adrian closed the account books. He stood and walked to the window. The rain had stopped. The sky was clearing. And he made a decision. He would not allow this to continue. He would not allow his family's name to be complicit in injustice. And he would not allow Marianne to bear the cost of her own integrity alone. Marianne learned, through a conversation with her family solicitor, that the engagement to Thomas Ravenshire had never been formally sealed. There had been no signed contract, no official announcement. The understanding between the families had been verbal, tentative, and subject to change. Thomas himself had never made a formal proposal. He had simply allowed the arrangement to proceed, passively, without commitment. This information came as both a relief and a burden. It meant that Marianne could, if she wished, step back from the engagement without scandal. She could reveal that Thomas had never truly committed, that the arrangement had been more her family's hope than his intention. She could free herself, but doing so would humiliate him. It would expose him as indecisive, indifferent, or worse. It would damage his reputation, and by extension, his family's name. And Marianne, despite everything, could not bring herself to do that. She had been raised to protect others, even at her own expense. She had been taught that a woman's role was to smooth over difficulties, to preserve dignity, to bear burdens quietly, and so she made a choice. She would not reveal the truth about Thomas's lack of commitment. She would allow the engagement to dissolve quietly, if it must, but she would not be the one to cast blame. She would protect his honor, even if it meant sacrificing her own. This decision did not go unnoticed. Adrian, through his own inquiries, learned of it. His steward, who had connections throughout the county, mentioned in passing that Lady Marianne had refused to speak ill of Thomas, even when doing so might have freed her from scrutiny. Adrian listened, his expression unreadable, and felt something shift inside him. He had thought, when he first read her letter, that he had found someone who shared his sense of conscience. But now he understood that it was more than that. Marianne was not simply questioning injustice. She was willing to bear the cost of integrity herself. She was willing to protect others, even when they did not deserve it, even when it would have been easier, safer, to let them fall. Adrian had never met anyone like her, and he realized, with a clarity that was both exhilarating and terrifying, that he could not let her go. He began to take action. He met with his steward and his solicitor. He renegotiated the terms of the land agreements. He reduced the rents on the tenant farms. He restructured the debts so that they would be paid from other sources, sources that did not depend on the suffering of families who had no voice. It was a complicated process. It required careful maneuvering. But Adrian was patient, methodical, and determined. And as he worked, the engagement between Thomas and Mary quietly dissolved. Thomas, when confronted by Adrian, admitted that he had never been particularly invested in the match. He had gone along with it because it was expected, because it was convenient, because he had not thought deeply about it, one way or another. When Adrian explained the financial entanglements and the moral questions involved, Thomas seemed relieved to step back. He was not heartbroken. He was not even particularly disappointed. He simply moved on. Marianne, alone in the drawing room of Ellsworth Hall, believed she had lost everything. The engagement was over. Her reputation was tarnished by the Duke's mysterious visit. Her family was anxious and confused, and she had no idea that Adrian was working, quietly and relentlessly, to undo the injustice she had named. Autumn deepened. The leaves turned gold and red and fell from the trees. The air grew colder, and one morning Marianne received a letter. It was delivered by a servant from Ravenshire house. The envelope was cream-colored, sealed with the Duke's crest. Inside was a formal invitation, written in Adrian's own hand. Lady Marianne Ellsworth is invited to visit Ravenshire house at her convenience. The Duke requests the honor of her company for a private conversation. Please reply at your earliest opportunity. Marianne read the letter 3 times. Her hands shook. Her mother, who had been hovering nearby, demanded to know what it said. Marianne handed it to her without a word. Mrs. Ellsworth read it, her eyes widening. He wants to see you. Alone. Marianne, what does this mean? I do not know, Mary said quietly. You must accept, her mother said, her voice urgent. This is the Duke, Marianne. The Duke. If he is extending an invitation, you cannot refuse. Marianne nodded slowly. She did not know what Adrian wanted. She did not know what he would say. But she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she had to go. She sent a reply that afternoon. She would visit Ravenshire house the following morning. The night before the visit, Marianne barely slept. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what Adrian would say, wondering if he was angry, if he blamed her for the rumors, if he regretted coming to her door that rainy evening. She had no answers, only questions, and a strange, fragile hope that she did not dare name. The morning was cool and gray. Marianne dressed simply, in a dark blue dress with a high collar. She wore no jewelry. She pulled her hair back in a plain style. She wanted to appear composed, dignified, even if she felt neither. The carriage ride to Ravenshire house took less than an hour. The estate appeared through the mist, vast and elegant, surrounded by ancient trees and rolling fields. Marianne's heart beat faster as the carriage pulled into the courtyard. A servant opened the door and helped her down. Another servant led her inside. But instead of being taken to a drawing room, as she expected, she was led to the library. It was a tall, book-lined chamber, filled with the scent of old paper and wood smoke. Oil lamps burned softly. The light from the tall windows was muted by the overcast sky, and standing by the window, dressed simply in dark wool, was Adrian. He turned when she entered. His expression was serious, but not unkind. He crossed the room and stopped a few feet away from her. Thank you for coming, he said quietly. Marianne nodded, unsure of her voice. Adrian gestured to a chair near the fire. Please, sit. She did, her hands folded in her lap. Adrian remained standing for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. Then he spoke. There is something I need to say, he began, and I wanted you to hear it here, where there are no eyes watching, no voices whispering. Marianne looked up at him, her heart pounding. Adrian took a breath. The night I rode to your door was not impulsive. It was the first honest I had done in years. Adrian's voice was steady, but there was something beneath it, something raw and unguarded, that Marianne had never heard before. He moved closer, standing near the fire, the light casting shadows across his face. I have spent my life managing this estate, he said, honoring traditions, fulfilling expectations. I was taught that duty was the highest virtue. that personal feelings were secondary, that a man of my position must always act with restraint, with responsibility, with an eye toward legacy. He paused, and I believed it. I believed that if I did everything correctly, if I made every decision carefully, then I would have done enough, that I would have lived a good life. Marianne listened, her hands still folded, her gaze fixed on him. But your letter, Adrian continued, his voice quieter now, changed something. You wrote about conscience. You asked whether duty and conscience could coexist. And I realized that I had spent years ignoring that question. I had told myself that duty was enough, that if I followed the rules, if I honored the agreements, then I was doing what was right. But I was wrong. He looked at her directly, his eyes dark and serious. You were right. The tenant farms, the rents, the debts, the way those families were being treated, it was wrong, and I knew it. I had known it for months, perhaps longer, but I had not acted. I had told myself it was complicated, that it was not my responsibility, that my brother's affairs were his own. But that was a lie. It was my responsibility. It has always been my responsibility, and I did nothing. Marianne's throat tightened. She wanted to speak, but she did not know what to say. Adrian stepped closer. When I read your letter, I felt something I had not felt in years. I felt ashamed, and I felt grateful, because you had named something I had been too cowardly to name myself. You had asked the question I had been afraid to ask, and you had done it knowing it might cost you everything. He knelt then slowly, so that he was level with her. His gaze did not waver. I have spent the last weeks correcting what should never have been allowed to happen. I have renegotiated the land agreements. I have reduced the rents. I have restructured the debts so that they are no longer paid by families who cannot afford them. I did not do it to win your favor. I did it because you were right, and because I could not continue as I was, knowing what I know now. Marianne's eyes filled with tears. I thought I had ruined everything, she whispered. Adrian shook his head. You revealed everything, and that is not the same. For a long moment, they sat in silence. The fire crackled softly. The rain began again, tapping gently against the windows, and Marianne felt, for the first time in weeks, that she could breathe. Why are you telling me this? She asked, her voice barely audible. Adrian's expression softened. Because I want you to know that you were not wrong, that your conscience was not a burden, that the question you asked, the question that no one else dared to ask, was the most important question of all. He paused. And because I want you to know that you are not alone. Marianne closed her eyes, and the tears finally fell. She did not try to hide them. She simply let them come, and Adrian, still kneeling before her, reached out and took her hand. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had carried burdens alone for too long, and were only now realizing they did not have to. Adrian rose slowly, still holding her hand, and helped her to her feet. They stood facing each other, close enough that Marianne could see the lines of weariness around his eyes, the tension in his jaw, the quiet strength that he wore like armor. I have no right to ask this, Adrian said, his voice low, but I must know. If you were free to choose, without duty, without expectation, without the weight of what others need from you, what would you choose? Marianne's breath caught. No one had ever asked her such a question. Her entire life had been shaped by what her family needed, what society expected, what was proper and acceptable. And now, in this quiet library, a man was asking her what she wanted. Not what she should want, not what was best for everyone else, but what she, Marianne, truly desired. She looked at him, her heart pounding, and spoke the truth. I would choose to be seen, she said softly, not as a daughter to be married off, not as a lady to be managed, but as I am, with all my doubts, all my questions, all my flaws. Adrian's expression shifted. Something tender and fierce flickered across his face. Then let me see you, he said quietly, and let me be seen in return. It was not a declaration of passion. It was something deeper, a covenant, an acknowledgement that they were both more than the roles they had been assigned, that they were both worthy of being known, fully and honestly, without pretense or performance. Marianne felt something break open inside her, something that had been locked away for years. She stepped closer, and Adrian did not move back. He simply waited, his gaze steady, his hand still holding hers. I am afraid, she whispered. So am I, he replied. And then, slowly, carefully, He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it, not with flourish, not with performance, but with reverence, as if she were something precious, something worth protecting. Marianne's eyes closed. She felt the warmth of his breath against her skin, the steadiness of his presence, the quiet certainty that she was no longer alone. And when she opened her eyes again, Adrian was looking at her with an expression she had never seen before. It was not pity. It was not obligation. It was something she had not dared to hope for. It was love. Adrian drew her closer, his movements slow and deliberate. He gave her time to pull away, to change her mind, to retreat. But Marianne did not retreat. She had spent so long guarding herself, protecting her dignity, managing her fears. But here, in this room with this man, she felt no need to hide. When he kissed her, it was not rushed or desperate. It was slow and certain. The kiss of a man who had waited years to feel something real. The kiss of a man offering himself, not claiming a prize. Marianne responded, her hands resting against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath the fabric of his coat. She felt his warmth, his strength, his vulnerability, and she understood, in that moment, that this was not a fantasy. This was not a dream. This was real, flawed, human, and more precious because of it. When they parted, neither spoke immediately. Adrian rested his forehead gently against hers, his breath warm against her skin. The rain outside had softened to a gentle patter. The light through the tall windows was pale and peaceful. "I do not know what comes next," Adrian admitted quietly. "I do not know how to navigate this. I do not know what people will say, or what obstacles we will face, but I know I do not want to face any of it without you." Marianne closed her eyes, a smile touching her lips for the first time in weeks. "Then we will face it together." Adrian pulled back slightly, just enough to look at her. His hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away the last trace of her tears. "Together," he repeated softly, and in that word, Marianne heard a promise. Not a promise of ease, not a promise of perfection, but a promise of partnership, of honesty, of shared burdens and shared joys. They stood together in the library, the fire burning low, the rain falling softly outside, and allowed themselves to believe, for the first time, that love was not something to be earned or negotiated. It was something to be chosen. And they had chosen each other. In the weeks that followed, the engagement between Marianne and Thomas was formally and gracefully ended. The families agreed, publicly, that it had been a mismatch of temperament. No blame was assigned. No scandal erupted. Thomas, relieved rather than heartbroken, soon turned his attention to other pursuits. He left for London and did not return for months. Adrian began to call on Marianne openly. He did not hide his intentions. He did not shroud their courtship in secrecy or ambiguity. He arrived at Ellsworth Hall in the clear light of day, announced and proper, and asked permission to spend time with her. Mrs. Ellsworth, initially bewildered, soon came to understand that the Duke's interest was sincere. Her anxiety gave way to cautious hope. Her husband, a quiet man who rarely interfered, observed Adrian's character and gave his approval. Marianne and Adrian walked the grounds of her family's estate. They sat together in the small library at Ellsworth Hall, discussing books and ideas. They spoke about the reforms Adrian had implemented on the tenant farms. They spoke about the future, about what kind of life they wanted to build, about the responsibilities they would share. Their courtship was not marked by grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It was quiet, deliberate, built on respect and shared conviction. They learned each other slowly, carefully, with the patience of people who understood that love was not a spark, but a steady flame that had to be tended. Marianne's mother watched with a mixture of relief and wonder. She had expected her daughter to marry for security. She had not expected her to marry for partnership. But as she observed Adrian's steady presence, his quiet attentiveness, his genuine respect for Marianne's thoughts and opinions, she began to see that this was something rare, something worth celebrating. Marianne herself felt a transformation within. She was no longer the dutiful daughter, silent and compliant. She had found her voice. She had spoken her conscience. And she had discovered that there were people in the world who would not punish her for it, who would instead honor it. Adrian, too, had changed. The man who had once hidden behind duty and restraint now allowed himself to feel, to hope, to imagine a future that was not simply a continuation of the past, but something new, something built on choice rather than obligation. They announced their engagement in late autumn. The news was met with surprise in some quarters, approval in others. But neither Marianne nor Adrian paid much attention to the whispers. They had learned, through trial and sacrifice, that the opinions of others mattered less than the truth they shared. They married in winter, on a cold, clear day in early December. The ceremony was held in the small chapel on the Ravenshire estate, a stone building with stained glass windows and wooden pews worn smooth by generations of worshippers. The guest list was intimate. Marianne's family attended, a few close friends, some of the tenants from the estate, who had come to respect the Duke's recent reforms and wanted to witness the union. Marianne wore a gown of cream silk, simple and elegant, with long sleeves and a high neckline. Her hair was pinned back in a style that was both modest and graceful. She carried no bouquet. She wore no jewelry, except for a small gold locket that had belonged to her grandmother. She did not need adornment. She was beautiful in her simplicity, in her quiet confidence, in the way she walked down the aisle with her head held high. Adrian stood at the altar in dark wool, his expression calm, but his eyes bright. He watched her approach, and for a moment, the rest of the world fell away. There was only her, only this moment, only the promise they were about to make. The vicar spoke the traditional words. The vows were exchanged, and when Adrian slipped the ring onto Marianne's finger, his hand was steady. When she spoke her vows, her voice did not waver. They were not promises made lightly or out of obligation. They were promises born from trial, from choice, from the willingness to see and be seen. After the ceremony, they walked together through the winter garden. The trees were bare, their branches stark against the pale blue sky. The ground was hard with frost, the grass brittle and silver, but the air was crisp and clean, and the sunlight, though weak, was clear and bright. Marianne slipped her hand into Adrian's. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked softly. "The rain, the letter." Adrian smiled. "Every day." "Do you regret it?" "Not for a moment." Marianne laughed quietly, leaning into him. "Neither do I." They walked in silence for a while, their breath visible in the cold air. Around them, the estate stretched out in all its winter stillness. It was not a season of growth, but it was a season of rest, of preparation, of quiet hope for what would come. "I used to think, Mary," and said after a while, "that love was something that happened to you, something you fell into, or were swept up by, something beyond your control." Adrian glanced at her. "And now I think love is something you choose," she said, "every day, in every small decision, in every moment when you could turn away, but decide to stay." Adrian stopped walking. He turned to face her, his hands gently holding hers. "Then I choose you," he said quietly, "today, tomorrow, for as long as I live." Marianne's eyes filled with tears, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude, of relief, of joy. "And I choose you," she whispered. They stood together in the winter garden, the frost glittering around them, the sky vast and clear above. And they understood, in that moment, that they had found something rare, something worth protecting, something that would sustain them through whatever came next. Years passed. The estate thrived under Adrian's careful management. The tenant farms prospered under fair agreements. The families who worked the land no longer lived in fear of rents they could not pay. The reforms Adrian had implemented became a model for other estates in the region, and though he never sought recognition for it, his name became associated not with cold duty, but with justice. Marianne became more than the Duchess of Ravenshire. She became a partner in the truest sense. She worked alongside Adrian, meeting with tenants, reviewing accounts, making decisions about the future of the estate. She was respected not because of her title, but because of her integrity, because she listened, because she cared, because she had proven, long before she became a duchess, that she would not turn away from difficult truths. They had children, 2 daughters and a son. They raised them with the same values they had fought to uphold in their own lives. They taught them that duty without conscience was hollow, that privilege came with responsibility, that love was not a feeling but a choice, made again and again, in the small and large moments of life. And in the quiet hours, when the children were asleep and the house was still, Marianne and Adrian would sit together in the library. The same library where he had first confessed the truth. The same room where they had chosen each other. One evening, many years after their wedding, Marianne was searching for a book when she found something tucked inside one of Adrian's journals. It was a letter, folded carefully, preserved. She recognized it immediately. It was the original letter she had written all those years ago. The letter that had been meant for Thomas, but had found its way to Adrian instead. She held it in her hands, rereading her own words. The doubts, the questions, the quiet plea for integrity. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were still clear. Adrian entered the room and saw her holding it. He stopped in the doorway, a small smile on his face. "I kept it," he said simply. "I know," Marianne replied, smiling. "Why?" He crossed to her, taking her hand. "Because it was the beginning, not of a mistake, but of everything that mattered." Marianne set the letter down gently on the desk. She looked at him. This man who had ridden through the rain to her door all those years ago. This man who had chosen to see her, to honor her, to love her. "Do you ever wonder," she asked softly, "what would have happened if the letter had gone to Thomas instead?" Adrian shook his head. "No, because I believe it went exactly where it was meant to go." Marianne smiled. "So do I." Outside, the evening was quiet. The estate was peaceful. The land was cared for. The tenants were secure. And within the walls of Ravenshire house, two people who had once lived under the weight of duty had built a life based on something deeper, something truer. The letter had been sent to the wrong brother, but it had found its way to the right heart. And in the quiet warmth of that library, where truth had once been spoken and vows had been formed, their love continued, steady, deep, and true.